we've got a great session on the whole question of shareholder voice in corporate decision-making, and a stunning pair of speakers for this afternoon. So delighted to welcome Sandy Boss, who's a Senior Managing Director and Global Head of Investment Stewardship at BlackRock, and also Luigi Zingales, who's Professor of Finance at Chicago Booth. And I mean, the context for today's discussion doesn't really need a lot of introduction. We are in a world where increasingly business and investors are expected to take account of their wider impacts on society, and as a result of that, we're seeing asset owners express preferences for businesses to act in a way that aligns with their values as opposed to necessarily financial value. And the question then becomes, how should we think about that? There are some very kind of tough choice cases that arise with that. How should we think about it? What are the mechanisms needed to make that a reality? So each of Sandy and Luigi are going to give a short presentation to outline their views. I'll probably then take the chair's prerogative to ask each of them a question, but I'm sure there are going to be an overwhelming number of questions that will require us to cut this session short before everybody's had their say. So I apologise in advance for that, but we will very quickly move it into open Q&A. So without more ado, Sandy.
Okay, whoops, now I've got to get past here. Thank you. Okay, I'm not going to do anything formal. What I thought I'd do, though, is just two things. First of all, thank you very much for having me here today. As a non-academic, I'm deeply intimidated by the wave of credentials coming at me. But as a practitioner, I'm here to talk about, first, what I do, and then also the Voting Choice Initiative. Stewardship, I think it's important to note, stewardship is part of any asset manager's fiduciary duty on behalf of their clients. So the money belongs to the asset owners. Asset manager doesn't own the money. Asset manager operates on behalf of those asset owners and under a fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty says asset manager must operate in the economic interests of those clients, the end owners of the assets. It is a little more flexible in Europe. There's more acceptance and generalized understanding of concepts like double materiality, where depending on where you are in Europe. In the US, it is very much an ESG integration, risk and opportunity, economic interest objective. The function that I have, so the stewardship function, it serves as a link between those clients, the end investors who pick their asset management mandate, and the companies that were invested in on their behalf. And so the function engages in sort of three types of activities on behalf of those clients. One is to engage with them on generally beneficial environmental, social, and governance issues. Third thing, and that, by the way, from our perspective, is year in, year out, multi-year, long-standing, and often aligned dialogue, because most large corporations that are going to be worthy of visits from their institutional owners are looking at similar issues as being the sources of value. Second thing, proxy voting. If the client chooses to authorize the manager to vote on their behalf, that's an explicit decision that is made by that client, and that the client ultimately is responsible for the voting and can delegate that responsibility to the asset manager, and often has done so. And then obviously we are engaged in policy debate, because as a big manager, it is beneficial for us if the general direction of travel, public policy, and what we would like to see private corporations doing is more or less aligned. It is beneficial when there are common standards and global objectives. It is beneficial when public policy is doing what it needs to do so that it is not the burden on private sector to solve all of the world's ills. If we think about then how we do this, it's a team of 70 people. It's been a massive investment for us, great increase in the last couple of years. It is multi-local. We're talking to people in 55 countries. We're voting in 75 countries, 165,000 votes a year. 99% of those are on management proposals. 1% are on shareholder proposals, which are almost entirely in the US and bizarrely Japan, because you can put up to 25 proposals on a shareholder ballot in Japan just by owning like a couple of shares. And they do involve some esoterica, which we won't discuss. But basically, shareholder proposals, even though you wouldn't know it, is almost exclusively, the important ones are a US phenomenon. And so most of the voting is governance. The voting is director accountability, independence, attendance, director diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, tenure, and things like compensation. So this is mostly a very governance-centric objective function because well-governed companies then also manage a variety of environmental and social risks well. Clearly now we are also, like most managers, increasingly focused on environmental and social risks when they are material because that is then driving and value on behalf of our clients. So that's all lovely, and if one thinks, I am delighted that BlackRock is my manager because they are providing incredible diversification of markets and variety of products, and it's low cost and it's great client service, and I want BlackRock to vote my shares, fine and dandy. But as was noted, there's also increasing interest for asset owners to become more involved in their own proxy voting decisions. And so what we have been doing, which is quite unusual, is introducing at scale voting choice. And very simply, what voting choice does is it enables, in a much more easy fashion than has ever been the case before, asset owners to take back their own voting decisions. We're incredibly excited about it. It's now about half of our institutional equity index AUM, which is a very big number, north of 2 trillion. Pretty much everything other than ETFs. Now this functionality can exist. Our clients are incredibly excited about it. There's been a lot of uptick. For those of you who like papers, and I know that's all of you, we're publishing a small non-academic but fact-including paper in about 2 weeks' time, which we can circulate to the group. So the way that the voting choice works, and again, this is for institutional funds, institutions, so that's pension fund, it's a insurance company, might be an asset manager who's running a fund on behalf of their retail clients, can do their own voting. So they can basically own infrastructure. I've got a policy, I've made it up, I execute it. We've made that easier than it's ever been before. Second thing, and quite practical, is menu of options. So we've now taken this into pooled funds, smaller clients, so any product of an institutional structure, the client can say, well, I don't have the resources to define my own policy, but I'd like an off-the-shelf policy. These things exist, you can pick flavors. There's several of them already up and running. We think it'd be great if there were more, but so essentially I can say, mostly I'd like to vote this way. And then that gets implemented across the thousands of companies in that individual client's portfolios. We also have a very flexible option, which is just enabling a client to say, completely trust you, but I'd like to vote, I don't remember where the lady is, I'd like to vote the largest Australian mining companies and the largest Australian, okay, there we are, exactly, my site's not that good. So I'd like to take back for very specific companies, or I'd like to take back the vote on all climate proposals. So if someone wants to do that, we can essentially do voting on behalf of with that extra tip of client involvement on those items. And look, the only thing I'll say, and then we'll turn it to Luigi, is next is how do we tackle ETFs? And what I would say here is there's operational challenges and in some cases legal and regulatory challenges. So the most important thing to think about is the individual holder of the end ETF does not own the securities that are owned by the ETF. They don't have any legal right to those companies. They own a share of a company and that company or a fund, and that fund invests in those companies. So essentially, mechanisms need to be devised such that the fund board, who actually owns the vote decision and who today hires the asset manager to do the voting, the fund board needs to be enabled, comforted in being able to pass voting input down to the end holders. There's also operational challenges, which is you have to find the end holders. Most asset managers don't wholly distribute to their own end investors. We have absolutely no record of who holds BlackRock ETFs. And interestingly, a huge portion of those ETFs are actually being bought and sold and traded on a daily basis by wholesale asset managers who've essentially shoved them into active products and are doing active overlays on top, and that's an active strategy. So kind of benchmark center with active periphery around it. So getting to who is doing the ownership is going to be operationally challenging. we're going to do a pilot in the UK. It's all very exciting. We think it's practical. We need someone to host a widget, to be able to find the individual owners. And we think the right way to do this is probably policy specific, as opposed to, let's take Russell 2000. If you hold the Russell 2000, there's probably, 17,000 proxy items that need to be voted on an annual basis. It's kind of more than you want to do. So we think policy choice is probably the right way. And then in the US, actually, we think we're going to need to do more work with policymakers because there's a very complicated tapestry of rules associated with the kinds of things that we want to do. So I'll stop. That is what I got to say now.
Thank you very
sure.
much. Luigi.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation, and it's very exciting to talk after Sandra because what they're doing at BlackRock is, I think, very important. If you start from the principle that investors care about things other than just money, they care maybe mostly about money, but care others, then one of the trends that we have seen in the last 100 years is that companies have, business activity has been more and more corporatized, and more the corporatization has become sort of embedded in a system in which the minimum common denominator is the money component. And so if you are a private company and you are an entrepreneur, you care about things other than money. The moment this company goes public and is traded and is owned by funds, blah, 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 all the other components disappear. The only thing you're left is with money. So we add what Oliver and I call a amoral drift, in which we converge to our completely amoral companies. If we want to undo this amoral drift, we need to bring back the vote by the shareholders. And what she's doing is one important step in that direction. Let me tell you sort of, and this is a collection of work I've done with a number of people, but let me tell you sort of what I think is the ultimate goal that we want to achieve. And as Sandra said, it's going to take a while, but the ultimate goal, because there is an increasing amount of interest by shareholders to actually vote on these issues. And some of them even get some majority of the shares. And this cannot be reconciled with the fact that investors are purely selfish. And so some time ago, Oliver and I said maybe we should consider companies, individuals, when they invest, that they are mildly pro-social in the sense that they care about their individual payoff, but they put a little weight, and this lambda can be as small as you can imagine, on the social welfare function. So imagine that people are pro-social in that direction. And now, let's now look at a particular thing that is under a lot of people's attention, which is the mask bid for Twitter. And imagine so that rejecting the bid will cost shareholders something, because after all, it was a 20% premium. So if you reject, you probably lose 20% of your shares. So let's call C, and then in a numerical application, this C is going to be 120, but it's not relevant 120. The important is you think a C. And then some people put a value on having a Twitter without mask. Now, I personally don't particularly put a lot of value, but others do. So I think that that's the beauty of the system. Some people put a value, some people don't. And what is the trade-off faced by the shareholders? So in voting, and the important thing, it depends a lot on how many shareholders there are. Why? Because let's suppose for a second, this of course is false for Twitter, but for a lot of companies may be relevant. Suppose that Twitter has just 3 shareholders, each one owning a third of the company. Then when these shareholders determine what to vote, they're going to vote internalizing the fact that they're going to lose 20% of the value on a third of the company. So this is C divided by 3. And then they're going to put a weight lambda. For each shareholder, this lambda is going to be different. On the value created, the value created is B. Now, these people are pro-social, so they value also the cost that other people bear, which is the other 2/3 of C. So people vote in favor of rejecting the mask bid if their lambda is bigger than, if you use the number I put, 40%. Okay, so that requires an enormous amount of pro-sociality to vote against the bid. Now, imagine that instead of 3 shareholders, there are 100 shareholders. Okay, of course there are many more than that, but imagine 100 shareholders. Then the calculation is each one of them pays directly 1/100th of C, and then put a weight lambda to B minus the remaining of C. And now we're going that only takes a weight of 2% in order to reject the bid. And now you get the point that if we go to infinitesimal shareholders, like all of us should all be indexed and so own very little of Twitter, then we all gonna vote in favor of the proposal or to reject the proposal in this case of Musk whenever B is bigger than C, which is as long as your lambda is not exactly 0. So unless you are super, super selfish, you are gonna vote in every election like the central planner would like you to vote, because you're gonna vote in favor every time B is greater than C, you're gonna vote against all the other times. So dispersed shareholders are, in a sense, fixing the problem. Now, of course, this is true as long as we all agree what B is, but as I said at the beginning, people have different view of Bs. So what we want to see is there any evidence that in this situation people will vote and will vote in what way? So what we started is some survey evidence in where we ask a representative sample of 2,000 Americans the following question. As a shareholder of Twitter, you will get to vote to approve or reject the offer. And if Musk offer is rejected, so if you vote to reject, you will not get the premium, and this will make you lose. And we randomize between 3 levels, $60, $120, and $250. Now, these numbers are not randomly chosen. These numbers correspond to what you would lose if you had a portfolio of $250, $500, and $1 million in your 401k. Why? Because Twitter happened to be 0.1% of the S&P 500. You lose 20%, you do the calculation, basically that's the number you come up, okay? And if Musk succeed, then you get a premium and he will run the company. And then we randomly, half of the sample is reminded that he might be pivotal, half of the sample is not reminded, and we ask how they vote, okay? And this is very preliminary, but this is the result we obtained literally 2 days ago, okay? So 68% of the people vote in favor of the Musk bid, which means that 32% of the people vote against. Okay, so in spite of the fact that this is really value accretive from a shareholder's point of view, 32% are willing to vote against, and whether you remind or not that they're pivotal doesn't really change their percentage. Okay, interestingly, the cost is not a real factor here. So yes, if you pay $250, you have only 64%. If you pay only whatever was 60, you have 70%. So there is a little bit of effect of the cost. Not gigantic. So where is the gigantic effect? Conservative versus liberal, okay? If you are conservative, 93% of the people say, I'm in favor of Musk. If you are liberal, only 38% of the people. So a vast majority are willing to pay, and doesn't really matter whether you pay 60, 125, or 250. Basically, they are willing to pay the cost in order to express their mind and make a difference. So conclusion, I think that this is very preliminary and a lot more research needs to be done, so I'm cutting short because I've short the time, but it seems that shareholders are willing to vote their values, and that's the good news. And they're willing to vote their values even if this implies paying some cost. The question is then why we shouldn't let them vote. And for those of you who are more interested in the technical detail, we have a paper we just finished with Oliver that showed that we also show that the outcome deliver Caldo X efficiency. So it's not only sort of an example. I think this can be generalized, and that's the reason why I'm so excited what Sandy is doing, because I think BlackRock is trying to some extent to give the vote to the shareholders so that they decide what they want. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, if you could both come and sit at the front here, and Sandy, when you roll out your retail offer, you've got at least one client, so that's good news for BlackRock. If you sit, I
don't think they can leave off me, but anyway.
I know US professors are much better paid than over here. Thanks very much, fascinating. I'm just going to ask each of you one question, and actually, by all means, ask each other a question. If you have a question to ask each other, then I'll throw it open to the audience. Sandy, starting with you, I mean, there's a lot of sense, really, and I can absolutely see why BlackRock is facilitating end clients voting directly. What we know from the research evidence here is that when it comes to affecting real-world outcomes, which is, of course, what asset owners are wanting to do, the combination of voting and engagement is really important, not just voting. So how will this sort of voter choice interact with engagement? Because I'm guessing you can't have sort of multidimensional engagement strategies that are open. So I'm just interested in how you're thinking about the engagement side of things.
Sure. Well, look, for us, the engagement function that we're doing, year in, year out with these companies, I mean, it's really a utility across all of the investors and all of the strategies that are invested in these companies. So far, when we've gone out and talked to, say, our U.S. pension fund clients, 8% of them, and again, see the paper, a percent of them are saying, we'd love to do this, this will be great. But a lot are saying, gosh, that's a really interesting thing, it's very new, I'd like to keep talking. And a lot are saying, I'd like having you vote. So there's no question that we will be continuing to be engaging with companies and voting, for many of them for quite some time. Now, when it comes to the integration, I think that's the most powerful thing, because when we do talk to a company and there's a voting-related consequence, things do happen. So one of the things that we've done, taking the example of climate, we've actually gone to engage with about 1,000 of the most carbon-intensive companies on the planet, which happen to be the most carbon-intensive companies in our clients' portfolios. And we've got a pattern now, which, again, this will publish later in July, year in, year out. Have we engaged? What was the target that the company had set in terms of GHG reductions in 2020? How do we see that developing over the course of a 2-year period? Which of those companies have we engaged with, and what kind of voting have we done? And just at a high level, what's very clear is that some of the companies we're engaging with were already leaders, and they're becoming ever more leaders. But there's a lot of activity associated with engaging and voting and then seeing companies improve in terms of how those targets are progressing. Now, that's not causal from BlackRock, because this is actually a topic of discussion that many, many asset managers and many, many banks are having with those companies. But we do see that correlation, and we think that's quite valuable. If issuers ask us, they do have questions about a world where asset owners take back voting but don't engage. So I do think there's a legitimate question over time. What I've been discussing with our clients is, look, if you're invested in a core index product or a ESG tilted index product, this functionality is really designed around what we call ESG integration, a very balanced approach that recognizes that environmental and social risks should be considered as part of that economic proposition, that fiduciary duty. Now, some of our clients are actually seeking to drive change. They actually care about the dual materiality that Luigi spoke about. And in that case, the funds that they should be investing in, which may have a more activist engagement component, should be what in Europe we would use Article 8 or Article 9 terms, probably Article 9 terms. So what's important for the coherence of the system is that if a client wants double materiality activism as part of their proposition, including going to companies and asking them to take ever more strident targets and goals, that's really an impact strategy. That's not a core indexing strategy. Most of what we do, 90% of our equity investing is index investing, which hasn't signed up for that.
Okay, that's a really helpful clarification. And I mean, Luigi, to you, I guess the, I mean, what Sandy's described there is a little bit different in the sense that it's focused on the integration philosophy as opposed to the voting for values philosophy. And one of the challenges, it seems to me, around the voting for values philosophy is that on a vote-weighted basis, it's kind of wealthy people that own the shares, right? And I think that if this was seen as a mechanism, particularly when it's raised in political areas where views are very different, and even things like climate change are like that, if you had a situation where this was seen as a way for kind of wealthy people to impose their political views on the way corporations act in a way that bypass the political system, that might not be seen as sort of a great social innovation. But how would you respond to that challenge?
So I draw a very sharp distinction between what I call private provisions of public goods and what I call political engagement. And I think that corporations are are completely allowed and should be allowed to be in the business of private provision of public goods. After all, we are sitting here in the Saïd School of Business in the Annie room as an example of corporations that have donated to in institutions like Oxford. And we don't think that we want to prohibit corporations to be engaged in that, particularly when they have a comparative advantage. So think about pollution. It takes more money to fix pollution than to prevent it. And so there is a room for agreement among the various stakeholders to, if you can find a strategy that prevents pollution, and because there is some efficiency gains, okay? And particularly when one side in this coalition, which are the shareholders, they are willing to bear a cost. This is something that the language of investors is, in the language of investors, this is a forbidden fruit, because you never say, we are willing to do this at a cost. No, it's a win-win solution. We can do both things. But in reality, there are trade-offs. And I think that shareholders should be allowed to say, I want a little bit lower return in exchange for not killing babies with my pollution. Okay? Very different than a situation of a political pressure, like we're discussing at lunch about the don't say gay law in Florida, and I'm Disney, and I decide to mobilize my resources to undo what the democratically elected Congress of Florida has decided to do. I find this very divisive and not something that corporations have a political an efficiency advantage, a comparative advantage, and is going to create a huge amount of tension. So I think that corporations should be out of one, but should be fully engaged in other, especially when you see who's paying the cost.
Okay, do you have questions for each other before I throw it open to the floor?
Well, I guess, I mean, a thought or a question is the following. So the people who own the money and the people who manage the money have a fiduciary duty. And they need to follow that. And so there is this core economic problem. And the language that you use and the example that you use is very values-centric, which is kind of okay in Europe and is very much not part of the objective function in the States. And so I guess the question I have is, as we think about the legitimate questions to ask of private actors, whether it's asset managers, asset owners, or corporates, from my perspective, anchoring that in their legal construct is actually really helpful. But, for me, academic literature that explains why I should be operating in terms of social values can be unhelpful because it just creates further tension associated with what we're legally required to do. So I'm just kind of curious about how you think about researching something that I can't act on. I don't mean that to sound testy.
No. First of all, I'm from Chicago, so tastiness is part of the menu. But besides that, I actually think that, and I have to preamble, I'm not a lawyer, but with this preamble, I am actually fascinated by the fact of how the fiduciary duty in the United States is a very vague concept, which is actually shaped very much by economic thinking. So what we are doing is we are working to shape the fiduciary duty of the future under which you will be working. Because today in the United States, if you go ERISA rule simply say, in the exclusive benefit of their investors. Now, exclusive benefits, nowhere in the ERISA rule is written that there should be financial benefit. Now, there is a Supreme Court decision, but we know this Supreme Court is a bit strange. So a Supreme Court decision that has said, we should interpret benefit as financial benefit. But, Supreme Court precedent had been overturned before, and they will be overturned pretty soon in June. So I think that there is room, if you provide good economic analysis, to say, this makes no sense, because in a fiduciary relationship, I want you to act in my interest. And he said, in my interest is to make you as rich as possible, but to kill you. That's not your interest. We all agree that. And so particularly when it comes to, let's say, some retiree in California. And yeah, you're going to have a lot of money to spend, but your house is in flame and you can't sort of go outside because there is too much smoke. That's not a life worth living.
But this is why I just push back a little bit on this, though, Luigi, because I think you sort of created almost this distinction between, you talked about Saïd Business School and it creating a public good and versus pollution, which is obviously reducing harm. It's much more complicated than that. And I think climate is a great example because actually, rich and wealthy people can afford to pay a little bit more for their gas and, and whatever else. If they want to actually say, well, I don't want to be part of actually these vulnerable developing world coastal communities being flooded and harmed. But actually that may impose costs on other US citizens in other areas that depend on the fossil fuel industry, for example. And so actually, through these mechanisms, you can have wealthy shareholders just deciding allocation of costs and benefits across the economy when those people do not have the compensating factors that would come through the democratic process. So it does seem to me that it's not quite as clean cut as you're describing.
No, wait a minute. Let's say that we decided in company X, we're going to operate as if the cost of the emission is actually $100 per ton, which is a proposed kind of level of a carbon tax. So that cost will be borne almost entirely by the shareholders who make that decision.
Well, would it? It would also be born in product markets, and it would be.
Why would it be born?
It's practically done, right? So most companies now are enlightened enough, if they're large carbon-intensive companies, even in Asia, in developing Asia, to be moving in a direction of accepting that the externalities, that their greenhouse gas emissions, that those are a problem that they need to internalize because regulatory / tax costs are coming in their direction. And so the good news is that when we engage with companies and when we're looking at shareholder proposals, it is globally increasingly recognized that having governance mechanisms, internal pricing mechanisms, business plans, targets for how you're going to reduce those emissions, that has become good practice because it fortunately is both a good idea from a pure economic perspective. It's also generating obvious societal good. And I think companies understand that. Politicians don't. But I think companies actually increasingly understand that. And some politicians absolutely understand it, but it's more debated. It's more debated. So I do feel like there's an increasing alignment in those actors, on the part of those actors, that those are beneficial directions to take. But it's incredibly important, and at least when we're engaging with companies, to have the dialogue around how are the decisions that you are making affecting groups that are most exposed, for example, to today's inflation situation, today's energy crisis. So, for example, just give you a very specific case. Luigi had mentioned earlier that shareholder proposals are getting absolutely increasing levels of support. Well, they're not actually this year. It's quite likely that right now they're about cut in half. And a lot of it is because the proposals that have come out this year are so incredibly prescriptive that they've gone past reality. So they say, stop producing fossil fuel now, never finance fossil fuel again, never underwrite a fossil fuel business for any purpose if you're an insurance company. And they're getting rejected because they're not acknowledging the feature that you're describing. But it's very difficult because if you only own 1% of 1% of 1% of 1% of the company, it's very easy to say, idealistically, I want pro-climate. And it's really hard to know that the actual proposal is, to a certain extent, fighting against the commitment that company has made to increase production for purposes of fueling Europe because of the Ukrainian war, right? And so that's where this stuff can get really difficult and where it needs to be nuanced. But it's also why we absolutely think more shareholders, if they want to, should do their own voting, because for some, they are values-driven, and particularly in Europe, they can be more values-driven, whereas from our perspective, we have to have this very, very grounded analysis of what is in the best interest of this company and the shareholders of this company at this time.
I'm going to throw it open to questions now. Right, we've got a flood of them. We'll start here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gordon. Isn't BlackRock really getting rid of a hot potato? That is to say, isn't that what's significantly behind this proposal? And I appreciate it in the sense that the challenge has been, the big three, the big one, the political pushback that is associated with that. So the strategy that, of course, makes sense is to essentially pass back voting responsibility to your clients, who are not really asset owners because, you know, they have a share in an index fund which, you know, is not specifically an ownership stake in any of the firms on which they're now asked to vote, right?
They are the asset owners. They actually
these are the
own
separate
shares.
accounts or the
separate accounts or in a pooled fund. They are still the asset owners.
Right, but I thought the proposal for the United States anyway was, as Fink described it, 40% of the index fund, the AUM in the index fund were going to be the pass-through voters, which are actually funds. But putting aside the technology, the terminology of asset owners versus not, but I mean, isn't a significant advantage to an asset manager that basically you're putting back to the clients the responsibility for voting and thereby divesting yourselves of the power and the responsibility actually to vote on issues as to which values might well disagree. So it's less motivated by a Luigi idea to actually consult what might be the alternative values of the shareholders, the pension funds, et cetera, but really a survival strategy for an asset manager like BlackRock to take itself directly out of the crosshairs to the extent it can by saying we're managing in a certain way, but the voters are those guys. And
okay. I got the question.
Got the question.
So I'm part of our global executive committee. We talk about this all the time. We didn't have this functionality before I came. We decided to launch it. And we decided to launch it because we talked to hundreds of our clients and they said we want it. So basically, this is about enabling our clients to have a choice. So if our clients want to do this, because they are the owners, it's their money, they own shares. In the institutional funds, they are ultimately the shareholders, and we are pooling that on their behalf, but they are legally owners in these companies, then that's great. Now, it's important that if clients don't want to do the voting, that it be done. From a corporate governance perspective, a world in which voting didn't happen wouldn't be good in terms of ensuring that boards and management were being responsive to the interests of the people who've ultimately given them the money. But you know, for us, it's really about enabling that. I mean, I guess I would put it sort of back to you this way. If this were all about the thing that you're describing, why have Vanguard and State Street not done this? They haven't, I don't know, they haven't followed us. But you know, we think it's a great idea. And we've been talking to all asset managers about doing this because we actually think the ecosystem will be better. But I mean, my guess is, you know, it's quite funny. There's a very conservative conference that happened a couple of days ago, and someone said on the record, voting choice is very annoying because it will reduce our ability to villainize BlackRock. And I said, I think they'll still come up with a way to do it. I'm just saying.
I think we can be confident about that. So, Luigi, I mean, I'm interested in this. The distinction has been drawn between what Sandy's proposing, BlackRock is doing, and what you were advocating. So, how close do you think the two are?
I think that they're actually quite close. I don't dismiss that in Sandy's objective function there might be also the one of passing the hot potatoes, but to some extent I don't mind because that's the right thing to do. So whether she does it for strategic reason or for, I think after all, when we invest, we should have the right to shape our investment. We have cash flow rights and voting rights. And so far, the voting rights have been frozen in a refrigerator and used in a very ineffective way. And now we're basically saying we want to enable people to have more voice and more choice.
I think one of the challenges we haven't figured out what to do with is the following. So today, and this is US data, individual holders of shares directly, only about 30% of them vote. That's not a big number, right? Now, today, if you have a fund, like a closed-end fund, and you go out to individual investors and you ask them to vote on a matter for the fund, they're a holder of the fund, they get called, they get a proxy statement. It's a question like, you know, can we pay a dividend or just, you know, can we restructure? They can't get quorum. So one of the biggest challenges that we have to break as an industry is it's amazing. Individuals are really excited, about answering a survey. I don't know how many of them didn't respond. Like to get to 2,000 respondents, how many of them had to be called? Because of course it's usually about 5% response rate. But so we have to figure out what's the right question to ask these individual investors. I think it's probably not what do you want to do on every item. It's probably flavor A, flavor B. But then it's also this question of if they don't want to do it, somebody's got to do the voting.
Yeah. Okay. Right, we've got a lot of questions. Okay, I'm going to progressively go around and give everyone a fair share. But I think you've got the mic.
I've got the mic. It's on now.
Total power.
Yes. So this is a question I think primarily for Luigi, but I'm very interested if Sandy, if you have views on this as well. So. The model you have with an externality and with voting, blah, blah, it makes perfect sense to us economists. But of course, a carbon tax also makes perfect sense to us economists. So then the question is, whether in the real world that doesn't seem to be working like we economists would hope that it works, your proposal would work. And I was struck by your survey evidence, because your survey evidence at least suggests, it doesn't prove. It might just be about the perception of the public benefit being created or destroyed, that individuals at least would be as polarized voting on this stuff if they're voting as shareholders as they are if they're voting as democratic voters. And that you might get, if you were actually to kick these decisions to the investors, you might get the same sorts of outcomes we're getting at the political process. For example, if you're against a carbon tax, then you're happy now in the United States because you don't have one. You think probably that we should have one. I think most economists think that. But it's not clear to me that we would get any different results, and we might just mess up the shareholder voting process.
It's funny that this attitude that you have to preserve this process as if it was a great thing. I think that the current system of corporate governance and voting is the closest thing to US-Soviet election taking place in Western world, okay? Because you have a number of seats of directors that is equal to the number of opposition. You can vote yes or abstain. Now, even worse than the Soviet Union, you actually recorded the way you vote, so you can be retaliated afterward. And basically, everybody gets elected, and the incumbent chooses the people. So I don't know what is so great that needs to be preserved. I think that, honestly, I don't care about the final process. I care about the final outcome. I care the process. I want a good constitutional system is not a system that delivers the outcome you like. It's a system that is robust to some extent. And I think in this particular case, people have different preferences. Why cannot them express? And if sometimes they're going to be polarized. Fine. Sometimes they're not going to be polarized and make a choice. But you cannot blame whoever. Or you cannot delegate all this decision to one person. In a sense, I think that not only the corporate governance system resembles the Soviet Union, the decision process resembles the Soviet Union, because you have basically three people, Larry Fink, and whoever decides State Street, and whoever decides for Vanguard, that less public, they decide for all corporate America, because they have a majority in every fund in the country, and they decide the policy.
Larry doesn't decide any of our voting.
Okay.
He doesn't know any of our votes until after they've happened.
So maybe now we discover that it's not Larry Fink, it's Sandy Boss.
Well, yeah, I mean,
but whoever
it's not Larry.
That's fine. It's not personal to me. I don't want to vilify X or Y. I just don't trust a system that gives so much power to just one person.
But Sandy, I mean, how do you feel about this risk of actually somehow, you've mentioned it already actually in terms of getting a quorum. I mean, do you think there are other unintended consequences of sort of disintermediating the voting chain in this way?
The single biggest risk that is faced in the context of democratizing voting is that all the votes start getting decided by ISS and Glass Lewis.
Yeah.
That is the single biggest risk. Because if you take, for example, the Index Act, which has been proposed by senators in the US, it says unless you can get individuals to vote, the vote goes silent. So what that would mean is it would take the points that are held by ETF holders, and they would no longer effectively vote, and what's left would be small asset managers who vote according to a couple of proxy advisors. So, I had a conversation with someone who was in an activist situation recently. It happened that they were managed to fend off the activist who didn't actually have a value creation hypothesis other than your performance isn't good, which is odd, because usually they need to have a plan. But they said that they spoke to 100 investors, and the number of investors who said to them, I really don't do my voting, it's done by Glass Lewis and ISS, sorry, I can't help you, was very, very high. So I think you have this situation where you need mechanisms where there's more voices, like we 100% agree with that, but you want to think about how can you get more informed voices. And so things like, I was saying at lunch, in France, I used to be a financial regulator, and FRC in the UK, many of you know, is trying to diversify the accountancies. There's a few accountancies, we'd like more voices. In France, what they've done to solve that problem is they have said every single major corporation must have an audit conducted by both a large audit firm and a small audit firm. It causes the outcome of giving business to small audit firms and basically teaches them how to do CAC 40 audits so that they can take on more business. So I think getting more diverse proxy advisor voices will help, because again, your individuals, what we want them to do is to not only have a voice, but also to have a mechanism, since they can't look at all of these items, how can they get their voice represented? And I think it's probably looking at some kind of a policy lens versus, they'll be really interested in the Elon Musk thing. I'd be really interested if we're going to get a vote, but typically it's going to be tendered. But so the real issue would be, how can we get those people to have somebody helping them on their side with the process so that they can act and so that they can express their view and not bother, because it's the not bother that's really worrisome.
It's almost like the analogy to political parties in a political system. You need groupings that will coalesce views and...
Yeah, parties.
Yeah, sorry, I probably shouldn't have brought in political parties. Right, there are so many questions, I've lost track of the order, so we're going for a fairly anarchic approach to allocation. The gentleman who now has the mic here.
Yeah, I had a question on, there's a lot of concentration of votes in time, right? Because many companies have the same fiscal year end, and so they meet at the same time, and there's a lot of requirements to vote at the same time. And there's some research that has shown that ISS actually seems to kind of have produced more mistakes around those busy times. And so while there might be economies of scale of concentrating efforts because you do the research and so on, so there might be some reasons for a natural monopoly for ISS and companies like that to show up. On the other end, they become really busy at this time. So it would be nice to have the small shareholders come and vote, but they don't have the economies of scale to do that. Can they really replace the big companies that are also struggling at the same time? There seems like to be a conflict here.
I think it's a brilliant question, and it is really complicated. If you hold a couple of index products, you can easily have 5,000 companies in your portfolio. So there is no way for an individual to interact with all of those. There's systemic ways that some of these things could be helped. So for example, spreading out AGMs throughout the year, it's possible. So it happens in Japan that there is a requirement that the business year ends on March 31st, and all AGMs must occur before June 30th. So 2,500 listed companies in Japan are voted between about June 10th and June 30th. That is not optimal because of this resourcing issue that you described. So that is something in theory that could be changed. And I do think that structural changes it would enable smaller firms to have more value add in the process. But I think inevitably, a lot of this stuff is very, very boring. Approve the auditor. Okay. Most individuals would feel comfortable with approve the auditor. Do I approve the Total climate plan? Most individuals actually don't care, and a small percent of them deeply, deeply, deeply care, and a lot of clients really care. So I have to figure out, how do you enable activity and engagement on the things that individuals and small clients care about? That's why for us, one of the options that we made was this hybrid model, which is essentially take the things that are boring, that are good governance, where you need economies of scale, give it to, by the way, you could give it to an off-the-shelf policy or us, so we're kind of agnostic on that, but then take the things that you really care about, the 50 largest oil and gas companies in the world and the 50 biggest banks, and pay attention to those, because you'll be able to use your interest combined with your resource in an intelligent way. And it would be equally possible to have small proxy advisors who specialized in the good stuff, right? And it's interesting, ISS bought a Swiss company that actually had a specialism like that. And so we just need that, ideally, flourishing of some of those responsible analytic groups who can help these really interested individuals, but also interested small investors.
Okay, thank you. Question in the middle of the back here.
Thank you. This is for Sandy. Have you looked at how your clients vote? Do they vote very differently from how you vote? And if so, do you draw conclusions about how you should vote?
Oh, that's interesting. It's early days. So if we look at clients who have historically voted on a separate account basis and who have essentially continued to use voting choice, these large institutions, there tends to be a reasonable amount of correlation with what we do. A lot of them are big European insurance companies. We tend to think reasonably similarly with them. Some of the biggest institutional investors in the US. What we're finding is that these smaller individual institutions who are picking up pooled funds are more likely to say, and this is interesting because I do think it correlates with Luigi's point, they're more likely to say, I would like a more activist approach to what we could call, sustainability matters. And part of it does have to do with the David versus Goliath mindset, where they will say, I'm doing my little bit. Now, it's complicated because they aren't really aware of or understanding of what the company is actually doing. They don't read the proposals. They freely say, we have no idea. One of the proposals we looked at this year was at Marathon Oil. So Marathon Oil received a shareholder proposal that said, please produce a 100-page report that does 27 things that describe exactly how, over the course of the next couple of decades, you are going to look after the workers in your business and the communities over this multi-decade period. And so they produced the 100-page report that addressed all 27 items. And the proponent said, we like our proposal, it's staying on the ballot, we refuse to withdraw. Now, an off-the-shelf policy will say, that's a good paper. We'd like that, because the person won't go look and see that they produced it. So that feature of the system it's a struggle, I think, and it's because of the economies of scale issue. But so anyway, so I think most of our very small European clients who want to do voting choice would say, it still sounds like a good paper, and I want to show my support.
So we've got 6 minutes. I want to try and get 3 questions in, right? So we'll get the
questions won't be the problem, be the answers.
Thanks. This is maybe a comment and a question for Sandy and Luigi. So back in 2007, I was here at the school and presented a paper on mutual fund proxy voting and suggested pass-through voting then. So it's nice, 15 years. But one thing I've noticed, though, too, is, Sandy, you mentioned that direct shareholders just don't vote at the portfolio company. So what you probably know is that these big institutional investors have a lot of swing voting power on really critical questions. And so I'm curious about your clients who are coming in for whom you run these managed pools. How many of them are doing pass-through voting? I mean, you sort of alluded to this, all the way down the intermediation chain to the true.
No one's doing that.
No one's doing that.
It's not technically possible to do that. So the closest thing that you have to that today, there's an organization called Tumalo, which kind of surveys interesting input. They don't use, sort of legally binding information, but they will reach out to end beneficiaries on behalf of an institution to gain insight into what those who respond to the survey think about certain questions. And then some UK owners and managers are thinking about what that means for their voting. But the concept of passing through to voting all the way to end beneficiaries does not exist. It just doesn't exist yet.
Do you think there's one last thing on this in the proxy plumbing things? Do you think ultimately there'll be proxy bundlers for whom I could say as an end investor on any kind of climate issue, in this particular ESG, I want that passed through? I mean,
Wait,
how would you handle
so
that?
So how it would work, and this is what we're exploring and what we're piloting in the U.S. I own shares in a mutual fund. The mutual fund board says, hello, shareholder. I've discovered who you are by working with a distributor. I would like to offer you 3 flavors of voting, which might be one could be inspired by ISS and one could be inspired by another proxy advisory firm. Do you want flavor A, B, or C? And then that individual could pick a button, and having done so, their style of voting could be enabled, and that could be executed as a pass-through vote. That couldn't yet happen in the US. There's a bunch of legal rules, and there's state and local as well as federal, but we think it might be possible to do something like that in the UK. So I think we are trying to get there, but no one's got there yet.
And Luigi, I think that was kind of broadly how you were envisaging this would work, isn't it? In terms of kind of flavours of stance rather than individual votes. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and hoping that if more people get engaged, then expands the market and creates more competition. Because I'm worried, like you are, that ISS and Glass Lewis might have too much power. I think that we need more fragmentation of power in this, and I think that hopefully this initiative go in that direction.
Good.
It's a new business opportunity.
I've managed to negotiate a little bit of extra time, if you're okay to carry on for a few more minutes. So, Dirk. Oh, so, well, okay, you've got the mic, and then we'll go to Dirk.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is super interesting. It's really interesting that there seems to be such a demand for this from the investor side. But what I'm struck with is this really feels kind of like a kludge for the legal system sort of like failing to protect the rights and the political system failing to protect the rights of other stakeholders that we're sort of voting for. So like, take the PG&E fire example. It seems like the answer to the PG&E fire example is to make sure that PG&E investors and PG&E bondholders are on the hook when PG&E fire victims need money. So like, there's so much investor interest in doing this. It seems like there's not a lot of political interest in holding people accountable through sort of like the standard legal system, and like where's the disconnect here? And the same goes for the environmental global warming example too.
Well, I mean, I can respond to that. Look, I do think that it's very interesting. I mean, I read a book, and I'm sure you've all read it, and I'll remember what it is. But essentially, and you're Chicago, so you can help me on this. When Milton Friedman wrote his theory, his original theories, a lot of the presumption that he had was the public policy environment was basically functioning. Most of the known social and environmental problems were being managed through a reasonably intensive regulatory situation. The problem of the world was a shortage of private capital to stimulate vast quantities of needed investment for purposes of economic growth. Private capital had been somewhat squished by heavy taxation and regulation, and so at that moment in time, there was an inflection point where go private capital, unfetter it, was indeed demanded. I think it's safe to say in some countries, and not all, and I think you could, without causing great controversy, contrast Sweden and the US. In some countries, public policy isn't necessarily doing some of the things that it might have done in the past, such as, for example, if there was an objective function to manage how much companies emit from a greenhouse gas perspective, you could have primary legislation in the energy market that would actually address that. And that's being done in many countries, but that's not being done in the US. I don't agree with the idea of investors and bondholders being personally responsible for the PG&E fires, because that's what limited liability means. The management does that. But I do think that a world in which there is conflagration, there is systemic fault. I mean, there's a reason that company went into Chapter 11 was because it was, overwhelmed by lawsuits. So I don't know. I mean, I think I don't have the magic answer for fixing all of public policy problems, but I do think that too many things right now are being put on, this is broken, business should solve it.
But I think that if this movement is in substitution of what you are saying, is very dangerous.
Yeah.
I don't see that as a substitution. I see that as a complement. Particularly, to me, the first ESG rule, the one that if was one dimension of the flavor that I would like that everybody to choose that flavor is to say, limit the lobbying power of corporation. Because part of what those distortions are that corporations are too politically powerful to the detriment of their own investors that invest in those companies. So the first, in my view, ESG rule is more transparency and more limitation, self-imposed, given that in the United States, unless we change the Supreme Court, we're not going to change that. We need to go that route.
Dirk.
Just briefly, sort of reiterating what others said before, in some sense, you're putting a lot of onus on the individual shareholders here to know, in Luigi's models, the B's and the C's, right? I'm happy to grant that they're going to understand the B's, how they feel about climate change or others, but understanding the C's at the corporate level, corporation by corporation, is going to be incredibly difficult, right? And that bears a bunch of dangers. And we, in the political realm, we don't do direct democracy kind of for that reason, because it tends to not work very well. And to say something that's probably going to make many friends. In 2016, we had a direct democracy vote in this country where my perception is that the majority of people with a good understanding of the C were not in favor of the proposal, yet the proposal won, and we're sort of now all living out the C's. And that worries me a little bit, right? And just a half thought, in equilibrium, if the system changes in the direction you're describing, we're going to get different proposals, and there will be unscrupulous actors who will try to take advantage of the fact that people understand the B's or feel strongly about certain B's and probably don't understand the C's very well.
I'm sorry, I have very little patience for people who go one example and reject a system by one example. I think that the direct democracy actually, when it's structured well, work very well. Look at Switzerland, look at California. Overall,
Luigi, that's one example, that's one country.
Look in the United States, the reason why we legalized marijuana in the United States is because of the direct democracy. I think that the one thing that Italy did right at the referendum on abortion, and a Catholic country voted in favor of abortion 40 years ago. Nobody's talking about this. In the United States, it was imposed through technocrats, and we're still fighting that battle. I think that trying to take away from the people and give it to technocrats is exactly what caused polarization and what caused the current movement of populism. When you actually give people the choice, and do they need to know all the details? No, because you can rely on intermediaries that give information and give votes, and actually the company has all the interest in the world to give you the cost. So I think that this can be easily fixed, and in a much better way that is done in democracy. And I've not heard anybody saying that we should take away the right to vote. That's the next step, I fear. But I think that the right to vote in corporate democracy is essential, in my view.
Yeah, rights to vote we'll discuss at 4 o'clock. And we had another question over here.
Just a comment. The conversation about strategies that Sandy's been talking about has been basically to take the basic structure of the mutual fund industry and twist it a little bit and drop some votes down to the shareholders. You can tell me how many different boards of directors BlackRock has. Each of those boards of directors are responsible to the shareholders of that group. How many times has BlackRock, let's say the stewardship group, looked at a board's performance, a board of a portfolio company, looked at the board, decided, we can think of 14 different former partners of major accounting firm who will do a better job than the directors of the portfolio companies, and sat down with the companies and said, look, we've got a lot of shareholders. We think your board is awful. Here's a list of people.
Right.
We'd like to see them.
So let me respond to that. If we did that, that's illegal. But
And why is that illegal?
because we and large asset managers in the U.S. operate as something called investment only. That's an activist action. So if you put someone on the board of a company, you have to actually file differently, freeze all of your positions. Yes. So, I mean, I can. So essentially, it's the investment only. So it's not illegal in the sense that, yes, as an indexer, if we wanted to intervene with the management and board of a company, that we could, in theory, freeze the shares and file as an activist to do that. But typically, what we would do, there's a distinction between what we would do and what you've said. So we would engage with the company and we would say, we see that your board is struggling. We think that you have an issue. You probably would agree. How are you going to solve this problem? Have you begun to pull off your board refreshment process? What are you doing to address the problem? Where we would stop is, I'd like to put my guy on the board. So that's the distinction.
And remember, the active managers in your portfolio, I'm presuming both no more than the stewardship folks, make a fair amount more money, because BlackRock listed the numbers they were paying when they added stewardship and fired 30 or 40 active managers. The framework that you're giving is constrained, I think, in terms of its ambition, but I think it's essentially not constrained in the legal way that you're describing it. But you've limited the way you can move to a very narrow stretch, which leaves out a lot of things that would make it a good deal more attractive, or your active managers.
I think you have to look at Hart-Scott-Rodino and the work that the FTC is currently considering to change the rules, which would essentially put every single significant transaction into an activist space and cause, until it is convenient for the FTC to review, positions to freeze. It's actually quite an interesting regulatory contemplation, and it's because they're concerned of the tradition of just engaging with companies under the SEC. Fortunately, it's quiet right now, but the SEC has guidance on what's reasonable, which would include my conversation, and it also has guidance that says you put your own person on the board. It's not okay, but so that's the zone.
Can we just? I'd just like to give the opportunity for one final question.
Yeah,
maybe you can pick it up afterwards. If that's okay, Mark.
So my question is primarily for Luigi, and it's a version of a question that we've already heard a couple of times, which is about potential unintended consequences. And it seems to me the result depends on the specification of B and C. So B is greater than C, and B is opposition to C. But what if you have a normally distributed B across the shareholders, and actually for some of those people, they get B as well as C, because their preference is for keeping, for selling Twitter to Musk. They really want to see that outcome. So there's a B bonus for them there. How does that play out in terms of the expected outcomes? If we, how robust is the model to the particular assumptions about B and C?
So if you're saying there are situations in which some people might be unhappy because the outcome is different from what they want, is true, but it's true in every democracy, it's true in every system. But to the extent, and we've not done all the cases, so I'm going to analyze more seriously all the possibilities, but by and large, when the majority votes, unless they make mistakes, and then it's a different story, but when the majority votes in favor, means that at least in principle, they could compensate the other for the tax they are imposing on them. And so that is a system that generally in democracy we think is good, and we proceed. Now, people are challenging that also in democracy. For example, the openness to trade is on average beneficial, but there are some distributional effects. And so we might discuss what the redistributional compensation to think. But I think that it is not any different from what we have today in democracy.
Okay. On that note, I would like to really thank Sandy and Luigi for a very stimulating discussion and for your patience in allowing us an extra 10 minutes.